Hey there, Podcast Aquanauts. It's your host, Casey here. Okay, a quick disclaimer about the upcoming episode. If you have rhinidophobia, an intense, irrational fear of frogs and toads, you might want to leap past this one. I suppose pretty much any episode of the podcast could use a disclaimer like that, but frogs, much like spiders and snakes, have a history of stoking feelings of disgust or being unfairly associated with distasteful things like warts and, to some extent, witchcraft. Personally, I think that's bunk, and we'll get to why in the upcoming discussion, but far be it for me to point a finger at someone for an uncontrollable phobia. Anyway, the rest of you frog friends and Anuranamigos out there are in for a real treat. Whether you're listening to this at the time of release or happening upon it sometime in the future, it's important to mark April on your calendars because that's National Frog Month. I think that's splendid because, spoiler, I also happen to think frogs are pretty splendid. To an even greater degree than birds, frogs are animals that you probably are more likely to experience with your ears than your eyes, which I think makes them perfect fodder for the auditory forum of a podcast. Many of us associate these amphibians most intensely with the onset of warmer weather, and there's something that just completes the picture of a southern summer evening to stand outside surrounded by an unseen chorus filling the twilight with chirps, croaks, and peeps. Whether it's the massive booming voices of bullfrogs or the bark-like calls of green tree frogs, these amphibians are a part of nature that's a delight for the ears, but frogs can be shy, silencing their performance and disappearing into the background when you get close. I've always loved that about frogs. They're like the most extroverted introvert in the animal kingdom, avid performers who hate an audience. I feel that, and I'm sure many of you do too. Anyway, it's time to get things moving along. I'm excited about this one, can't you tell? And I can promise you one thing, it's going to be riveting. Now, on with the podcast. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. It's about to get real froggy in here. It is National Frog Month. April is National Frog Month. And to celebrate frogs, because frogs deserve to be celebrated, I brought in a couple of veterans of the Podcast Aquatic, Tanisha La Guardia. Tanisha, you were on a past episode talking about yourself. And our Ambassador Animal Collection.
Right.
So please go back and listen to that episode because that'll give you a little bit more insight into Tanisha's background, although we're going to touch on that in the course of this episode too, but a little bit more detail in that past episode. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And next to you and across from me is Charlie Olson. Charlie, you are your title has changed. Are you senior herpetologist now?
I am a senior herpetologist.
So you were on a past episode talking about defending snakes, why people should not be afraid of snakes.
Yes.
All right. And actually, but weirdly, both of you have talked about that now that I think about it.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about snakes today. Today we are talking about frogs because, again, April is National Frog Month. And as a herpetologist, why would I have you in the room? What does herpetology have to do with frogs?
So I'm actually not just in charge of reptiles, but the broader herpetofauna around here, which includes amphibians. So I'm our primary amphibian caretaker here at the Tennessee Aquarium for our public collection. So almost any amphibian that you see out in the exhibits, I'm the one taking care of them.
So, but through detective work and deduction, you're saying that frogs are amphibians then?
Frogs are amphibians, and I'll go on record saying that.
I would argue that they are probably the most well-known amphibian.
By far. They are not as much seen, but everyone's heard a frog probably at least once in their life.
Ooh, we're going to talk about frog calls later, because that is definitely something that I think people associate frogs with, is the sounds they make.
Exactly.
So let's get a little bit of background. As I mentioned earlier, we were going to touch on just briefly your origin stories here at the aquarium. So, Tanisha, I know we went into this in great detail in the past, but can you give people kind of the elevator pitch for how you started working at the aquarium?
Yeah, so I started here as a volunteer back in 2018. I came here because I fell in love with reptiles. My daughter, she had a leopard gecko that she was afraid of, and I ended up being the one to take care of it and then fell in love with it. And I just wanted to be around other people who enjoy these animals because everybody in my life thought I was crazy at that point for loving snakes and lizards. And then when I got here, we had Susie Grant, who was over our ambassadors at the time, and she told me that I should do an internship. And so I did, and loved it even more, and got to experience other animals because I got to work with more or different kinds of reptiles, but also got to work with our penguins here, our lemurs, our otters. And so I got to kind of stick my toe in several different areas of the aquarium and realized that I wanted to do an entire career change, from a medical person who wanted to deliver babies to taking care of animals. So I've worked my way from being a part-timer all the way to now being the ambassador coordinator.
Yeah, I was about to say, I didn't even talk about your actual title. So you are our ambassador animal coordinator?
Yes. So I'm the one that's over all of our ambassador animals. So
which are what?
They are the animals that go out on the floor, go to different schools and events. They're the ones that you see and get educated by our educators with.
Very cool. All right. And Charlie, so you've been here at this point for what, 2 years, 3 years?
2 years.
2 years. And how did you come to join us here at the aquarium?
Yeah. So I went to a job fair one day and there was a zoo hiring, and I was like, that sounds like a pretty fun job, and started working at zoos and aquariums. And this year will be my 10th year in the field, working especially with reptiles and amphibians.
Where were you before for this? What zoo?
I've worked at 5 other facilities before here. Don't want to put them all on record, but
okay.
Yeah, I've been managing. Maybe the most fun one would be working down at Gatorland in Orlando.
That's fun.
Yeah, about 2,500 alligators and crocodiles.
Wow.
And doing a lot of crocodilian work down there.
Very cool. Okay, so all right. Your job obviously encompasses, you mentioned earlier, reptiles and amphibians. Tanisha, you mentioned very specifically that you are a fan of reptiles. How do you feel about amphibians?
So amphibians have been something I've had to learn about, still learning about. Thankful for Charlie to answer questions if I have them. But I really like them a lot. And frogs especially are an animal that a lot of people interact with first throughout their life. Usually when you're a kid, you're outside and you start catching frogs. And I love frogs mainly because that usually lets me know when we start hearing them that summertime, spring and summer's around the corner. And that gets pretty exciting for me.
Yeah, I think you're right that a lot of people have kind of early childhood memories of frogs. I remember catching them. Catching implies that I was more active than I actually was. I would find them in the filter bucket for my aunt's pool growing up. So it was kind of a reliable place to find lots of frogs in East Tennessee. All right. As I mentioned, April is National Frog Month, and there are a lot of people who work at the aquarium. Many of them have been on this show, obviously, and I try and home in on people who have obviously got some sort of expertise associated with whatever the topic is. So what's your association with frogs here at the aquarium, Tanisha? Because we've clearly delineated Charlie's involvement.
Yeah, so we have a few frogs in our ambassador collection. We have firebelly toads, mossy frogs, magnificent tree frogs, which are pretty cool, and then our marine toads, which usually is a fan favorite for most of our guests because they're so massive. And so I'm the one that gets to train a lot of our educators on how to handle them and how to talk about them whenever they go out on the floor with them.
Are they difficult to handle, frogs?
It depends on which frog. So firebelly toad, mossy frogs, they're relatively small. And so as long as you're comfortable holding a squishy animal and picking it up, it's usually relatively easy. And when you get to the magnificents, they're little, but pretty strong frogs. They can get away from you pretty quick if you're not ready for it. But then the marine toads, they're massive, like I said. And so it takes a little bit of skill to get those down packed with handling them. They got strong back legs. They've ripped holes in my gloves before because they're so strong and they kick. But they're super cool and they're fun to talk about.
You mentioned how big they are. I've actually seen a marine toad on more than one occasion get away from a presenter before too. In fact, one of our mutual favorite people, Julia.
Oh yes.
A former educator here, a legendary educator here at the aquarium. I watched her on a couple of occasions just in the middle of a program. That marine toad was just off the cart and hopping away.
Right, in no time. They can get away from you pretty quickly.
why should people care about frogs? Let's start there. Why are frogs important ecologically speaking?
Ecologically speaking, one of the big things is they are a true indicator species. Frogs are kind of the canary in the coal mine of how our environment is doing. So when we have healthy, strong frog populations in areas, that generally indicates that there's not high levels of pollution in those areas because they're so sensitive to especially like chemical pollutants in the water. They absorb a lot of things through their skin. And so even small trace amounts of some of these chemicals can devastate amphibian population pretty quickly. So scientists generally use them as like we're going out, we're seeing lots of healthy frog populations. This is looking like it's going to be a clean river system versus going into areas and you might not hear any frogs calling. And that can indicate that there's a major problem here.
Okay. So basically this boils down to the common explanation for why people should care about things in ecology, which is just be selfish.
Yes.
Care about it because you care about yourself.
Exactly.
Tanisha, why do you think that people should care about frogs?
Well, they actually control our insects. A lot of people, when they're going outside, especially starting when it gets warmer in the spring through the summer, we have mosquitoes that bother us every day. And
so many mosquitoes.
Yeah, especially when it's humid and hot outside. And you think of frog to help control that population because they love to eat those mosquitoes.
Yeah, I remember when I was growing up, I went to camp one year. And when my mom came to pick me up at the end of the week, we were walking around and we just kind of touring the property where the camp was located, and we came across a puddle that was just full, chock-a-block full of tadpoles. And I don't know what possessed my mom to say yes to this, but I asked if we could take some home, and she said, sure. And we went home with, I feel like it was like a pickle jar or something, and there was an unused terrarium on our back porch that I think might have been at one point contained an iguana or an animal or something. We had a lot of reptiles growing up. And we put the frogs in there, and I don't think anybody expected us to do well at frog husbandry, but we managed to successfully raise an almost obnoxious number of tree frogs, as it turned out. And we weren't sure quite what to do with them. And my grandparents, who had a notorious problem with mosquitoes for most of my early childhood, begged us to come and release them on their property. And within, I think, a year or two, you went from not being able to walk outside almost literally without being just mopped by mosquitoes to there not being mosquitoes on that property. So yeah, frogs definitely are great at insect control. I think the like great grandchildren or whatever of those frogs are still on that property because you could totally hear them at night. Just an army of frogs just attacking mosquitoes, taking care of that problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you did tell me that story. And since you mentioned tadpoles, one thing that I do like to talk about when it comes to frogs is just the life cycle.
Yes.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot in education. And I think frogs are just one of the animals that you can actively see quickly how an animal morphs into from a tadpole all the way to a frog. And it's pretty cool to be able to bring that to education and to bring that to kids and talk about it and show like the tadpoles and their purpose and how cool they are. And they eat algae. And then they start growing their little legs, which is super cool, while their tail's shrinking, and the froglets come and then they grow up to a frog. And so for us to be able to show the step-by-steps of how they evolve is pretty cool.
I mean, it's like magic. When you're a kid and you are first introduced to that term metamorphosis, you're either taught, I guess, the other inroad would probably be butterflies, I guess. But,
right.
But I kind of remember feeling when I saw that kind of like that circle with the arrows that you kind of always remember from your like third grade science textbook or whatever.
Yeah.
And thinking it was just like magic. I was going to go somewhere with that, and I don't know where I was going.
Well, one of my favorite things about frogs in general is how some of those species are just some of the best mothers in the animal kingdom. They're the maternal care that some, like, especially dart frog species provide to their babies while they're in that, like, tadpole phase is just really awesome, and it's really kind of a rare thing to see, especially in like reptiles and amphibians.
That is surprising. So when you say maternal instincts, what kind of behavior do we see that indicates that they're taking care of their offspring in a more protective way than maybe other animals do?
Yeah, so certain dart frog species, you'll see them actually like carrying their tadpoles on their backs. So they'll lay a mass of eggs, and then you can see the tadpoles developing in those eggs. And once they're about ready to burst out of that egg sac, the mom will come up and pick them up. They'll stick onto her back, and she'll carry them to a pool of water. And then some of them from there will actually feed the tadpoles. They'll lay unfertilized eggs for the babies to eat, and they'll come back multiple times, sometimes throughout the day, depending on the species, just to feed their babies those unfertilized eggs.
That sounds like something out of like a sci-fi horror film. Here, have some of your your unborn siblings to snack on.
It's the perfect snack, truly. And then we have everyone's favorite Pippa, the frog with the holes in its back where they keep their babies.
No, we talked about this on your last appearance. That's making my trapophobia go crazy.
You were such a big fan.
Yeah, I didn't know you had that. I actually have that too, which is intense.
So let's talk more about this frog, how cool it is.
For more information about phobias, including trapophobia, please see the episode that Charlie appeared in last. Carry on with your discussion of horrible whole frogs.
There are some frogs that actually keep their tadpoles in their digestive tract. They'll keep them in their mouths and sometimes actually in their stomachs to keep them safe. There's a million different ways that frogs have figured out how to take care of their tadpoles in a diverse array of situations that you could just never even imagine.
We kind of mentioned earlier, as we were talking about amphibians, that salamanders are obviously an amphibian. One of the orders of amphibians is salamanders, and the Southern Appalachia, where we are here in Chattanooga, is just lousy with salamanders. They're all over the place. It's a biodiversity hotspot for salamanders. Is the same true for frogs? Is this part of the country a frog hotspot?
It is certainly very diverse. We do have a lot of different species of frogs. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many, but there is some major frog diversity. I do believe some more tropical areas have a greater diversity just by numbers, versus like our salamanders, we just have the highest diversity of anywhere in the world. But you get into South America, some of these like dart frog communities, there could be easily over 80 or 90 species of frogs in some of those areas.
Yeah, let's talk about dart frogs, because Tanisha has already covered the species she cares for down in the ambassador animal holding area, but you care for many species of poison dart frogs as well as our mossy frogs.
Yes, that is correct.
I asked our registrar for a list of frog species that we have here at the aquarium. We have 9. Tanisha covers 3 of them, as well as, I think, don't you also have mossy frogs?
We do.
In the ambassador animal. So you both kind of covered that. And I think the other 6, most of them are either poison dart frogs or mantellas. So can you talk a little bit about what makes poison dart frogs so interesting in terms of their natural history? Because a lot of people probably are aware of, like, they've heard of poison dart frogs, but why are they called that? Where are they found? And then also, what is a mantella, and how are those two things kind of connected?
Yeah, so poison dart frogs are a small group of frogs in Central and South America. They're called poison dart frogs because historically indigenous communities in some of these regions would actually use the poison from these frogs to hunt. So they would actually dip their darts in a boiled frog mixture and use those poison arrows to improve their hunting abilities. They are a poisonous frog, so they're most well known because of how colorful they are. They have those bright colors in order to warn predators and be like, hey, don't mess with me. I'm poisonous. I'm letting you know.
That's why I like to wear bright colors too.
Exactly. And that's why I don't mess with you. But there are so many different species down there, and not only do they all have their own different color morphs, but they actually have their own different types of toxins too.
When you say color morphs, just before you carry on, what exactly is a color morph for people who maybe have never heard that before?
Yeah, so it can be the same species of frogs, like taxonomically. We could be calling it the same thing. Dendrobates azurus has different colors. So we have like a blue morph here. So it's that species, but it's blue. But there's also another one that might be more yellow or green. So yeah, you wouldn't know just by looking at them that they're the exact same species, but they are. Then they just do that through genetic work. But my favorite dart frog fact is when you see the frogs here at the aquarium, our frogs are actually not poisonous anymore. And that's not a purposeful thing, but when you have a frog under human care, they're actually taking that poison and they derive it from their diet. So they're eating a lot of ants and beetles and millipedes and things that are high in these like proteins called alkaloids. And that's how they produce that toxin. But here they get fed flightless fruit flies and pinhead crickets. And those insects aren't high in those same compounds. And so they're not poisonous anymore. So we can safely handle them, which you could
lick them
if you really wanted to. I probably still wouldn't.
Don't lick a poison dart frog. I'll just put that PSA out there, whether you think they're safe or not.
Yes, it's never a good idea to lick any reptiles, amphibians. I'll be bold and say that on microphone here.
God, this episode is just going off the rails.
But they're interesting animals. You asked about mantellas.
Yes.
Yeah, mantellas. So this is a good example of convergent evolution where two different types of animals kind of evolve a similar trait. So both of these frogs, even though they're not related to each other, became poisonous and have bright colors and are around the same size.
So you mentioned, before we carry on, you mentioned that poison dart frogs are Central and South America. So yes. Mantellas are found in Madagascar.
Correct.
So thousands of miles away.
Thousands.
No possible chance for them to have been connected.
Now, I would argue maybe it's not as cool as people think because there are a lot of poisonous frogs that aren't poison dart frogs. Even cane toads, which are something that are pretty common and you would see in Florida invasively, are poisonous. There's a lot of poison frogs out there. But these two do look pretty similar. So it does make them a pretty cool topic to look at.
Yeah, and they're also they're not nearly as colorful, I think, as the poison dart frogs, but they're still pretty colorful. And you can see them in our Island Life Gallery. I should point that out. They're in our one of our Madagascar exhibits in the Island Life Gallery.
Yeah, and there are a couple of different species. Probably the golden mantellas are the most colorful. We don't have any of those. But they are bright yellow, just like the golden poison dart frogs are bright yellow. And those golden poison dart frogs are actually the most poisonous of all the dart frog species.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. So we talked about them being in Madagascar, Central and South America. I think we maybe touched on Florida. Those are places that are very warm. They're humid. Are those the places you're more likely to find frogs? I mean, it's not nearly as hot and humid. I mean, it's pretty hot and humid, but it's not like swamp-like here in eastern Tennessee and southern Appalachia. So are frogs are they found in a wider range of habitats than maybe pop culture would have us believe?
Yes. I mean, in North America, we get frogs up in Canada.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, they go very high up. There are some adaptations that they have. Some frogs basically have like antifreeze in their blood so that they can survive in these really cold environments. And they do brumate. Generally, they'll spend a lot of the winter time underground and then come up for a couple of the warm months to eat and reproduce and then go right back underground.
So that's like an alternate survival strategy, kind of like hibernation.
Exactly. And it's very similar to what a lot of the like high latitude reptiles would do too.
Yeah. Do we have any brumating animals in the Ambassador Animal Collection, Tanisha?
Well, we personally don't brumate them just because they go out on programs a lot. But would you think that any of ours are a brumating species.
Well, you have the marine toads, which have a pretty cool wet, dry season adaptation. So they'll bury underground and they can secrete a mucus, and it essentially holds in that moisture for the drier seasons. The African bullfrogs do it a little bit more, but they'll literally dig down and create like this big pocket, and they'll just stay underground in this, like, it's literally a hardened mucus sac. Waiting for the rains to come back down.
Bringing in so many phrases and just words that people are not going to have great feelings about frogs. Mucus sacs and erupting from eggs and swallowing their babies and feeding
so beautiful
holes in their backs.
Oh God. Okay. You've derailed me. I've lost track of where I was going to take this conversation. So there are, according to AmphibiaWeb, which is how reliable a source of information is AmphibiaWeb?
Oh, it's really good.
Oh, good.
You get a lot of good taxonomic information off of that.
Good. So I can trust the figure that I'm about to throw out there, that there are 7,800 species of frogs in the world, or more than 7,800. So I think there are something like 8,800 species of amphibians, of which 7,800 are frogs or toads, that should tell you something about why frogs are maybe the most common amphibian that people are familiar with.
And we're still discovering new frogs all the time.
Are there places where we are more likely to discover frogs, where they're like actively finding more frogs than maybe other places, like the Amazon? Or
yeah, the Amazon is one of those hot spots where we're still discovering new frog species. Some parts of like Southeast Asia, any of these like dense tropical rainforests. Not only we're discovering new species, but sometimes we're rediscovering previously existing species that we were unable to find for a really long time.
Wow. So, Tanisha, I was going to ask you, since you do obviously take these animals out on programs, what do you like about using these particular animals in programs? What do you like about how or what they convey to the public and how people learn about an animal that they might not otherwise be able to have such a close encounter with?
Yeah, so like as I was saying earlier, that a lot of times people interact with frogs first whenever they are young, and so a lot of people end up having an appreciation of frogs a lot more than, say a snake. But they don't realize that there's such a diverse amount of frogs in this world. A lot of people just think frog, think green, what you would see in a movie like Princess and the Frog. So we get to bring several different types of frogs out for them to actually see the difference in size and where they come from, that they can be found either in Madagascar or Australia or right in our backyards. And so people tend to appreciate that even more. But they also have, their fears, like, if we touch this, or if I were to touch it, are they going to give us warts or something like that, which is a myth, not true. Frogs don't have warts on them. It's more of little glands that's on their bodies that look like warts. And so if you do touch a frog, other than the possible toxins, which we don't have really any around here that would harm us, but they might actually pee on you. Probably. So just be prepared for that, but you won't get warts from touching a frog. And I think people find relief when they hear that statement, that they're not going to get a wart if they go out there and grab a frog off a tree.
Which is a little funny, because you could actually be harming the frog more by touching it itself than you getting like warts on your hands.
Why is that?
So we have a lot of oils on our skins, and then we also have like chemicals just from like washing our hands. And frogs take a lot of things through their skin, like we talked about earlier. So when you handle an amphibian, they can be leaching those oils into their skin. It could be coating their skin to where they actually can't take in as much like fluids through it. So generally if we're out in the field or we're handling a frog, we try to wear gloves in order to protect the frogs. Not only from that, from also potentially like spreading a pathogen accidentally.
So you mentioned that frogs tend to absorb things through their skin. That's how they breathe, right?
Yep, certain species for sure.
Okay, and in general, amphibians need to remain moist most of the time. And here I am using a word that people probably also are going to get triggered by. And yet you can find some frogs and toads in places where you wouldn't sort of expect that to be the case. You mentioned Australia. Australia is sort of notoriously dry. And out in the American Southwest, you also can find frogs. So how do frogs survive, or toads survive, in places where there is little to no rainfall?
Yeah, so just like we were talking about, like brumation for hot and cold, theirs is going to be for wet and dry. So they're still finding that humidity by burying underground most of the time. So if we look at everyone's favorite rain frogs, which were like a TikTok sensation for a while, which are like the chubby little frogs that a lot of people have seen. They're like,
make some really interesting noises.
Yes. They're called rain frogs because people only ever saw them when it was raining. They spend almost 80 or 90% of their lives underground, buried, just kind of sitting down there. And then when it would rain, they would come up out of the ground. But they're finding these pockets of humidity even in some of the driest locations in the world.
So what you're saying is life finds a way.
Life finds a way. And as long as there's water, eventually they can figure it out.
All right. Of the species of frogs for which both of you are responsible, do you have a particular favorite to work with and care for, and why?
My favorite, I gotta probably say the mossy frogs.
I kind of figured you would go that way.
Yeah, we got a lot of them, so I better like them at least a little bit.
A lot of them is almost an understatement.
Yeah.
We have, what's our most recent count for that exhibit?
It's around 100 mossy frogs right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, and we're actually giving them a substantially larger habitat here in a couple of months, right?
Yes. So we're building a brand new mossy frog exhibit. We really wanted to dial in on replicating that natural environment, which the background setup that we have on our current exhibit really wasn't fitting that. So we're in the works right now designing a brand new exhibit that's going to actually have like some water features, waterfalls and trickles, and it's going to really replicate more what you would see in the wild compared to the exhibit that we have now.
Yeah, so those the current exhibit I think is like 36 inches wide. The new one's gonna be like 60 inches wide. So that should tell you it's a substantially larger exhibit. I interrupted you. You were telling me about why you like Vietnamese mossy frogs, which the name should tell you a little bit about where they're from, right?
Yes, northern Vietnam, southern China. They're cool looking. That's all you need to know about them. They look like a piece of broccoli come to life. Their camouflage is just astounding. Almost every day I see guests looking into that exhibit and unable to even see the amount of frogs we have in there because their camouflage is just so stellar. On top of that, they're pretty cute. When they are scared, because generally they're counting on their camouflage to save them, they play dead. So they'll literally curl up into a little ball, and you can kind of pick them up, and you're like, "Hey, buddy, you're all right. You'll be okay." Mm-hmm. Take them for a vet checkup or something. When you feed them, if you ever see a feeding, you'll actually notice their toes wiggle. And that toe wiggling is a luring behavior that a lot of frogs do, trying to get the crickets in close. So they're just very charismatic little frogs.
Yeah, when you say they look like broccoli come to life, before you get like Veggie Tales in your head, they've got they were covered with lots of really pronounced bumps, right?
Yes.
So they're one of the bumpiest frogs I think I've ever seen. I think I tend to associate toads with bumps. And maybe that's just me not knowing enough about frogs and toads, but I didn't think of toads as being more bumpy and frogs being more smooth skinned. Is that normally the case, or are these like an anomaly in terms of having so many bumps on their skin?
There's a lot of frogs in the world, and they got a lot of different skin textures going on.
So what you're saying is very politely that I'm wrong.
There's a lot of frogs out there.
That's fair.
Yeah, there's some that are even bumpier than this, and some that have all sorts of different things going on. So,
and rain frogs kind of look like one bump. Just
exactly
one bump.
They're kind of lumpy too.
All right. So mossy frogs, unsurprisingly, at least to me, are Charlie's favorite. Tanisha, what is your favorite species to work with here at the aquarium?
Here at the aquarium, I have to say the marine toads, also known as the cane toads. Like I said, they're so huge, and they're just a fun little surprise to bring out for everybody to see them.
They look like Jabba the Hutt.
They do. They really do. And so they are an invasive species. So it's interesting to talk about that with, people and what that means and how they got here. And, they were brought here to be able to take care of the cane beetle issue. I think that was in Florida. And they got here and they're like, we don't want cane beetles. We want to eat everything else. And so cane beetles apparently stayed the problem, but then the frogs or the marine toads, they ended up becoming an invasive species. And so we let everybody know what that means and, their story of why they got here and how they got here. But they're also helpful with taking care of pests and as well. And they also take care of like carrion that could be found in the road. And they eat all the dead things that's on the ground and clean up our environment. So they do have a purpose here as well.
Yeah, if you want to know more about invasive species and hear me stump for invasive species, because I feel like they're unfairly demonized by most people, see a fairly recent episode of the Podcast Aquatic, all focused on invasive species for a National Invasive Species Awareness Week. You mentioned that they eat so many different kinds of things. I think people tend to think of frogs, and I guess toads as well, if we're talking about stereotypes about frogs, or misunderstanding, think about things like the causing warts, that sort of stuff. They tend to think of frogs eating flies, right? So just insects, but they are they have more diversity of prey than that, right?
Right. I mean, sometimes we feed them rodents, we feed them fish, all kinds of different insects, not just flies, but like Charlie said, crickets and fruit flies, and we have mealworms and superworms. So they have a pretty wide variety of what they can eat.
Are they purely carnivorous? Do frogs or toads eat any kind of vegetation?
Not when they're adults. The tadpoles.
That's right. Algae.
Yeah, a lot of them eat algae, but even some of the tadpoles are carnivorous too. It depends on the species.
Of all the different kinds of animals that both of you care for, how do frogs rank? I mean, are they... You're smiling, Tanisha. It seems like maybe you don't think of as highly of them as maybe someone who's guesting on an episode about frogs should. How do you feel about working with frogs?
No, I appreciate frogs, and I've learned a lot about them in these last few years.
I appreciate the IRS. I'm not sure that I would want to get audited, though. So do you do you feel kindly toward them?
Of course. Yeah, they do a lot for our environment, and anything that helps us out and definitely takes care of those mosquitoes is a friend of mine for sure.
So you work with a lot of different reptiles and amphibians, Charlie. I know that you've waxed poetic on previous pieces of content about snakes and about salamanders. So where do frogs rank?
They're up there. I don't want to say an official ranking. I'll tell you that probably turtles are going to be my number one, just because of how much time I spend with them and how much conservation work we're able to provide for them here. But doesn't mean that the frogs don't deserve some love too.
And you, I know that you, Tanisha, have had kind of a menagerie of animals at your house. Have you ever kept a frog or a toad as a pet?
Yeah, I've had tomato frogs, which that is my favorite frog. They're from Madagascar, and they look like a little tomato.
They're little chubby red guys.
They're super chubby, super cute. They love to burrow. The females are usually the bright red, I guess you call that a ripe tomato look. And then the males are nice and orange, and they kind of have a little spots on them. So they're super great species of frog.
Charlie, you have any frogs at your house? Have you ever had frogs at your house?
Yeah, I've kept a couple of poison dart frog species before. I've had mantellas before. That's about it.
Are mantellas like a common species or group of species to find in the pet trade?
I wouldn't say frogs in general are the most common. They're not as common as like a ball python would be. just because they do require a little bit more intensive care.
I was going to say they seem like they'd be a little more demanding.
They can be. Generally, they require a lot of upfront care. So
what does that mean?
If you are really good at habitat design and you get a nice terrarium set up with live plants so you can keep misted very well, they're one of the easiest animals to take care of, because just them being in that environment, they're able to get all their needs, all their humidity needs. But if you aren't good at setting those things up, then they're one of the hardest animals to care for. This isn't really an animal that you can like put into a rack system very easily or put into like something with like a bunch of plastic plants. They're just a lot harder to keep unless you have those naturalistic systems.
So you talked about the mossy frogs, and you said we have a lot of them, and obviously 100 is quite a few. I've heard through the grapevine that within the zoo and aquarium community that's unusual, that they are not a species that is especially easy for people to propagate. Is that right?
That is correct, and then for a couple of different reasons. First off, the males and females are kind of hard to tell apart. They're not sexually dimorphic. The only difference maybe is the males have a larger, it's called a nuchal pad. It's kind of like, it looks like a thumb, and it gets big and red and swollen and it gets sticky during breeding season. But if you don't see that exact thing, then it's really hard to tell the difference between the males and females. The females can be larger than the males, but even size-wise, it's not a huge difference. And then they also have pretty strict requirements on where they lay their eggs. So they generally lay them over pools of water. And we have the perfect log in there right now for them to lay their eggs, and they love it. And the tadpoles fall from those egg sacs directly into the water and then start swimming around.
Yeah, it seems like whatever we've done, we've really struck on like the perfect habitat for them.
Oh, yeah. And there's even some studies on frog chromosomes, essentially. And you might even have a male and female mossy frog, same species, and they just might not be able to breed at all anyways.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Because a lot of the, it feels like constantly we're sending mossy frogs to other zoos and aquariums. It feels like we have like we like surplus them out, or whatever the terminology is. We have more than we need to have, and so we send them to other institutions.
Yes, for sure. I mean, almost like the last month alone, I've been contacted by at least 4 other institutions about acquiring mossy frogs.
Do they seem surprised that we have as many as we have? I mean, is it like a mystery to other institutions as well as to why our frogs are so prolific?
Oh, I've seen some people shocked by the amount of success that we've had. Like I said, they are notoriously hard to breed, and we seem to have a setup that works, and the frogs are happy and healthy, and they feel comfortable in the situation that they're in to produce those offspring.
Yeah, whenever you see offspring show up in a zoo or an aquarium, it's a pretty good sign that the animals are living a pretty good life, because animals that aren't comfortable don't tend to reproduce, right?
Exactly.
So we talked about hearing frogs earlier, and I had mentioned that I wanted to come back to that because frog calls are really one of the things I think people tend to associate them with. In fact, I think for most people, you hear frogs more than you see them. I feel like I'm surrounded by frogs at my house. I hear them all the time at night in spring and summer, and I live next to the interstate, so that should tell you something about how frogs are hardier than maybe we think they are. What is your favorite frog call? And I did not prompt either of you with this before the conversation, so if you don't have an answer in the moment, I can vamp while you kind of think of one. But spring peep, for me at least, you mentioned frogs being one of the early indications of the transition to spring. And for a lot of us here in the Southeast, if you grew up in the Southeast, and I did up in Knoxville, there's no sound that I associate more intensely with a season than spring peepers starting to call in the early parts of like March. That to me is like the sound of hope after just suffering through the winter. The sound of spring peepers going off is one of my favorite sounds. It's up there. The only one that comes even remotely close to me is cicadas. Cicadas in the summertime are like, that is the sound of summer. And to me, spring peepers, as the name implies, is like the sound of spring. Have I filled enough air for you to think of a frog call that you like?
Oh, I immediately thought it too.
Oh, good. Well, I should just let you jump in.
If we're going, I mean, they're both native just because those are the ones we hear. But bullfrogs, I love hearing a bullfrog on a warm summer's night sitting next to a lake. They're distinct. You don't have to like think about what frog is making that call. And they're just very, very just, I wouldn't call them beautiful, but it's a nice sound to hear. One that caught me off guard in the past was narrow-mouthed toads. I was visiting some friends in Alabama, and I was like, is there a sheep loose? What is happening over here? It genuinely was one of the weirdest sounds I had ever heard. And they were like, aren't you the frog guy? And that's a narrow-mouthed toad. And I immediately had to look up everything about this frog call. But it is one of the craziest things I've heard out in the woods of central Alabama.
The cool thing about frogs we covered a lot of cool things. One of the cool things about frogs is how outsized their voice tends to be for their body. Like they're one of the most shockingly loud kinds of animals. I remember the first time I saw like a tree frog thinking that it was much, much, much larger than they actually are because they're like the size of your thumb. But you can hear them from very far away because they just make such a loud sound.
Yes, and that's actually how scientists track frogs. They can tell what species are in an area by recording them and then playing back and seeing what species they can hear. But they can also tell how many frogs are in an area by listening to the calls. So a lot of frog conservation is done with microphones.
How cool. How fitting for a podcast.
Right?
Yeah.
Tanisha, what's your favorite frog call?
So I have a few in mind right now. I'll start with our ambassador ones. So the magnificent tree frogs, they actually call a lot. A lot of people will come in the ambassador space and they're like, what is that noise? And I'm like, it's the magnificents talking to each other. So
what do they sound like?
Your typical frog. I mean, there's nothing different from what it would sound like here, but it's just interesting that they do it several times a day, of all hours of the day. So it doesn't have like a distinct sound to me. It sounds like a normal frog, but it's really cool.
Sounds like frog.
Yeah, it sounds like frog. But we have our firebelly toads, and they are the quietest, cutest little sound that you will ever hear. It's like almost like a little chirpy noise. And you have to get really close to them in order to be able to hear it. But the first time I heard it, I didn't know what it was. And then I finally realized it was them, and it's super cute. So now I hear it every now and then. They'll talk to each other a few times throughout the week too. So I think that's really cute. But I don't know if this is the exact name of this frog, but is it a Kiko frog? Is that a real thing?
Yeah.
They literally sound like they're saying the word Kiko, and it's super cute.
Well, I feel like I have to find the audio and lay it under this part of the podcast.
They're adorable. Do they have like an actual
I think
name?
I just heard them. I think it's like kukri frogs.
Okay. They're super cute. You got to listen to it.
Okay, in our excitement to introduce you to this amazing amphibian, we flubbed the name slightly. The species that so captured Tanisha's heart by way of her ears is the coqui frog. This unassuming little brown anurant is native to Puerto Rico, and its call is interesting for more reasons than just sounding absolutely flipping adorable. The male coqui's call, as its name implies, consists of two parts, the co and the qui. The first, the co, is thought to be a warning to other males to stay away. The qui is thought to attract mates. Koki are actually a bit of a nuisance in Hawaii, where they were accidentally introduced in the 1980s via imported nursery plants, according to the Big Island Invasive Species Committee. By the way, when an animal says its own name, a la birds like the cuckoo, the whippoorwill, bobwhite, or the chickadee, or insects like the katydid or the miniature antelope known as the dik-dik, this is an example of onomatopoeia, the term for words that imitate or replicate the sound they describe. All right, back to the podcast.
Now, just to spit some fun frog facts at you real quick.
Please do.
Because calls, there is one species of frog that they thought was extinct because they had not heard their calls. And they went back to some historical areas and they were recording, never heard them. But then they kept seeing them. And they were like, what do you sound like? What is happening here? And so they were tracking these frogs down. And they eventually discovered that they were calling underwater in the streams. And they could stick a microphone in there, could hear all these calls underwater.
Like whales?
It was perfectly pitched for like fast moving streams.
Wow.
So they call only underwater. They never call above water. And that's how they find their mates. And they think that it was just because there were so many frogs in these areas that like the sound waves were full of all these other frog noises. And so they were like, well, no one's calling underwater. This is an untapped market right here. And got to calling underwater. And there's another species of frog. I believe it's called like a pumpkin frog is the common name. And they call, but their ears are actually unable to detect their own calls. And so they like essentially find their mates only by the visual of them calling. But they actually can't hear each other, even though they make a noise.
That's cool.
That's fascinating.
I'm learning stuff too.
And one thing that's always, I think in my brain, I always think they sound like bullfrogs, just because of their size. But what do the marine toads sound like?
You know, I have no idea. I have never heard them make a noise. I
Really?
haven't even looked it up. Have you ever heard a sound from them?
I haven't. I would be shocked if I didn't hear them in Florida, but I don't think I ever noticed any.
I don't know. We'll have to look that one up.
It's funny that you mentioned earlier, Charlie, that you have been that your friends kind of were shocked that you didn't recognize a frog by its sound, because I just not even 3 weeks ago sent you a voicemail, or not a voicemail. I sent you a recording from my phone of the frogs calling out at our conservation institute and said, "What is this? I want to post this and I want an accurate ID." So you're like, do you find that are you like the go-to for your friends when it comes to identifying frogs, or am I the only one who exploited that?
Yes. For anything reptile related, realistically, what snake is this is the most common one. What frog is this? Even if it's a plant, which I don't know anything about plants. But they're like, we'll just have Charlie Google it for us, you know?
That is one of the nice, unexpected perks of working at the aquarium for me. As a non-scientist, has been firmly and repeatedly established in past episodes. I am not specially trained in any of the scientific fields, but I have so many coworkers like the two of you who I just like on speed dial. So I send questions about frogs to you. I send questions about turtles to our herpetology collection coordinator, Bill. I usually will send bird questions and usually snake questions to our curator of forests, Kevin, who will be on if I'm looking at the production schedule in my brain, he'll be on an episode about birding here just a little bit. In fact, it might be the episode after this one, come to think of it. But yeah, it's an unexpected benefit of working here that I can just reliably ask for like a plant ID from our horticulturist, Austin, who has been on a previous episode as well. So it's an awfully nice perk.
Did you not recently raise frogs maybe last year?
I did. Yeah, that's true. Actually, I forgot. I reached out to you about that too. Our pool, we have a stock tank pool in our backyard, and I don't remember what species of frog it was. I feel like maybe it was a wood frog.
Sure.
It doesn't matter. I had frogs that just showed up in that pool and laid their eggs, and rather than get upset about it, we all thought it was super cool. And so I just did a little bit of history repeating itself, and we raised dozens of frogs with my kids. So it's kind of a neat little generational repetition there. We are closing in on an hour here, so let's go ahead and finish by talking about how we can be better friends to frogs. So you mentioned, or we've talked about, I guess, that they are a good ecological indicator. So they're very important to have for that reason, and for pest control, like you talked about, Tanisha. So how can we be better friends to frogs, which on the whole, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, are declining worldwide, in particular in the United States. Habitat loss and disease and I guess invasive species being in their habitat has led to a decline at a rate that in about 20 years they will only appear in about 50% of the places they currently are found. So how can we make sure that they feel welcome and safe on our properties? What can we do to be better friends to frogs?
Yeah. So 2 major factors here. Number 1 is creating just frog-friendly spaces at your house. There are easy, you can look them up, but you can literally take a PVC tube and put a cap at the end of it and drill a couple of holes about halfway up, and boom, you have a tree frog house. You slap that on a post or a tree or something and you're good. You can even...
They also like umbrellas, apparently.
They like umbrellas. They really love native plants. So whenever you're gardening, think about planting native plants. You can add a small pond into your landscape. Just don't add fish to that pond. They don't want to lay their eggs or have their tadpoles in areas that have a bunch of fish in it. So creating these frog-friendly spaces, and then also supporting frog conservation organizations. The Amphibian Foundation's a big one down here in the Southeast. Right now, the biggest thing that's affecting our frogs is chytrid fungus. It's a pretty deadly pathogen. Almost every, not just frog, but amphibian that gets it dies from it. And it is wiping out entire populations, almost entire species of frogs who are getting this. So helping these organizations who do early detection programs. So the Amphibian Foundation actually goes out and tests amphibian populations to make sure that they're still healthy, who are funding research into seeing how we can fight chytrid fungus, and then also funding programs that stop a new emerging fungus from getting into the United States. So we think chytrid is bad, but Europe has something that's called B-sow, and is actually worse than chytrid. It's not here in the United States yet, but in order to keep it from getting here, we need to be very vigilant, and we need to have these conservation organizations keeping an eye on it. So those, in my opinion, creating those frog-friendly spaces and then supporting amphibian conservation organizations who desperately need funding are going to be the best 2 ways to go about it.
Excellent suggestions. Tanisha, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just helping to keep our ground and our waterways clean. Whenever you throw out, dirty trash or anything like that, those chemicals and like that, they get on into the waterways and hurts our frogs as well. Because like Charlie was talking about earlier, just the oils on our hands and anything that can come in contact with their skin could be deadly to our frogs. So just making sure that we keep our area clean and throwing our trash away in the areas that it needs to be, and, reduce and reuse like we like to talk about. Like earlier we were talking about catching them. Sometimes it's just better to look and observe with our eyes. We don't have to touch, we don't have to pick up, just enjoy them from afar and, not touch them too much, and just keeping them safe like that.
It's my favorite adage from the previously mentioned Julia Gregory, the educator who we both hold in such high esteem. She taught me, and I have taught my kids, that we look with our eyes and not with our hands. I heard her say that all the time to campers and people in her classes. Hey there, Podcast Aquanauts. It occurred to me as I was putting this episode to bed that we somehow didn't circle back to discussing the difference between frogs and toads. Well, worry not. Our former senior educator, Julia Gregory, who has already been name-dropped a couple of times in this episode, has come through clutch. Several years ago, I asked Julia this exact question for a series of videos we created to answer our guests' most burning questions about wildlife. So as I used to do frequently before her retirement a few years ago, I once again lean on Julia's timeless expertise to sort this out for us.
Here at the Tennessee Aquarium, we do get that question a lot when we pull out the amphibians and begin to talk about them, especially these tailless amphibians called anurans or frogs. So there are 3 things that you can use to tell the difference between a frog and a toad. Only everything I'm about to tell you is a generalization. There's an exception to everything, single thing I'm about to say. As a matter of fact, there are probably many exceptions to every single thing I'm about to say. But you asked, so I'm going to say it. Frogs have smooth skin. Toads have bumpy skin. When they need to move from place to place, frogs prefer to hop. They have much longer hind legs. Toads, on the other hand, prefer to walk, unless it's, of course, it's an emergency, and then they can hop too. And finally, how they lay their eggs. Frogs lay eggs in clumps. Toads lay eggs in strings. All toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So frogs is the big umbrella, and toads are a subset.
I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap up today's riveting discussion about frogs for National Frog Month here on the Podcast Aquatic. Thank you for joining us for this very long episode, but I don't care. I think it was fascinating. I liked learning about frogs and toads. Thank you to Tanisha La Guardia and to Charlie Olson for taking the time out of their busy schedules to come in and talk about all things frogs. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
All right, and if you have any ideas for a future episode of the Podcast Aquatic or a question for an expert like Tanisha or like Charlie, send it to podcast@tnaqua.org. While you're online, go ahead and leave us a review or leave us a rating if you don't have time to write out a whole review. Those are both easy and free ways to support the show and help us with the algorithm. And until next time, remember that every drop matters.